Today, I had a discussion with a fellow tea farmer. My neighbor has been processing a lot of tea lately, about 500 kilo of fresh leaves every night for a week. So he's quite motivated because he has a big order and he uses a machine which uses natural gas, a pretty good machine actually. And he argued that nowadays there's no point in making handmade tea like I do now, that there is no future in that technique because the machine, when well mastered, allow us to make as good a tea as if it was handmade. And yet I feel like if it comes to making machine-made tea, I'd rather not making tea at all and have other people make it for me, because the machine, even though indeed, like my neighbor says, there's a need for some degree of mastery and you still retain the contact with the leaves, I think the machine is much more straightforward. There's more automatization. You just set up a time and temperature that of course you should adjust by looking at the leaves, depending on the tenderness of the leaves, whether they are wet or not, depending on the season. Sometimes the leaves are more dry, sometimes they have a higher water content. So of course you have to adjust, and there's a degree of expertise in that. But I still feel that cooking tea by hand is the ultimate connection that you have with the tea. And so that's why I come every year, every season to Jingmai to make that tea. And what kind of arguments could you give my neighbor in support of making handmade tea, if he argues that he can make as good a tea in the machine? Well, if you look at pu-erh, for example, well, expensive pu-erh is handmade, but actually the cheapest pu-erh is probably more accurately made by objective standards. Maybe if it's a Gaiwan, maybe the circle is more perfect than if it's handmade. And yet, a lot of people are willing to pay 10 times the price for a handmade object. And I think it's because when you buy an expensive piece of pu-erh, you don't pay for functionality, you pay for the art involved. And the same goes for high quality tea. Actually, when you buy expensive tea leaves, of course it needs to taste good, but somehow I think that's not enough. Maybe if Lipton went full on into pu-erh tea, they would manage to have a decent tasting product with their industrial standards. And yet I think the tea lovers wouldn't really buy their products. They would try it for sure, but they would probably stick with the more high-end tea, the artisan tea, like we like to say. And I think it's because for the tea lovers, when they are buying tea, they don't have a specific expectation when it comes to taste. Actually, it's up to the tea to deliver them a unique experience. And I would argue that this experience is better achieved with a handmade processing. Maybe because actually handmade processing gives a less standard tea, because sometimes there will be variations. It's the same as the fire. We like to use wood as a source of energy for a fire. Now a lot of people tend to go to natural gas because it's much easier to control. You have a handle here, it heats up faster. And yet I think that there's a particular charm about every day lighting the fire with the wood. And there are some irregularities. For example, I didn't film the start of this batch because the fire was much higher than I thought, and so I had to kind of fight with the tea in order to not get it burned. And these irregularities are really what makes the charm, I think, of high quality tea. I would also add another argument is that when I'm handling the tea, actually, I'm also kind of rolling it, or I apply some work on the tea leaves, which the Shaching G, the tea cooking machine, does not. In the Shaching G, it's a tumbler, so the leaves are just carried up and fall down by gravity. While here, I feel that I have more control when it comes to handling the tea. So you see, I like to do this kind of thing to separate the leaves and then make a batch, like open up the steam like this, have the steam leave the batch, or on the contrary, make a bowl with the tea and keep the steam inside. I feel I have much more direct control over the tea leaves. And I would say that a good work is not only the meaning of work is not the final product, it's also the way you make it. And I think artists will particularly understand this. For example, sure, you can take a great painting and just print it, and the print will be exactly the copy of what was painted by hand. But of course the piece painted by hand will be much more valuable. People will be willing to pay more for it, because people find value in what requires skill to make, in what is made by a kind of will. Like, in a way, you have to work hard on the tea when you're processing it by hand. And maybe it's a bit mystical, but you could think a part of that will is transferred into the value of this tea. Maybe actually, if you gave this tea to a robot, it wouldn't taste the difference between a machine-made and a handmade tea. But we are people who are tasting the tea, and I think having handmade tea is part of the enjoyment of the experience. And maybe if you know that the tea is handmade, maybe you will think, you will feel it tastes better. Maybe I'm deluding myself here. I'm in my tea making trip, but that's really what I think about the tea. And that's why for the near future, and probably the long future as well, I will continue making tea by hand. And when we buy tea in other mountains, well, at least for the more expensive teas, I would say that that's a requirement for us to have the tea handmade, because it requires us to find a skilled farmer, a farmer who can make the tea well. You could also think that the people who take enjoyment, or who process that tea by hand, they are more likely to source good leaves. They are more likely to putting more care into the work than those who use a machine. Now, of course, it also depends on your customer. You could say we're on the higher hand of the spectrum, and when big factories want tons of teas, and that tea must be to a certain standard in terms of homogenization, then it makes much more sense to use a machine. So you could say the machine-made tea really fits the industry, and the industry can make good quality products, of course. But I think that's maybe the difference. Maybe the difference between the premium market and the luxury market, and we would be in the luxury market, because in the luxury market, how the thing was made matters as much as the final result. It reminds me, for example, of biodynamic wine. Like all over the world, biodynamic wine is a big thing. Now you could, of course, that those biodynamic theories, they don't have much ground in terms of science, and you could argue that it's pointless to wait for the full moon and crush the horn of a cow and put it in your field and stuff like that. And of course, I think I agree. It doesn't make sense from a materialistic prospect, but people who put the time into doing those esoteric stuff, they are probably people who care more on average than people who don't. Now, it doesn't mean that people who don't do biodynamic wine don't care about the wine. It will depend, but I think it's a matter of probability. If you're into doing esoteric stuff, you're more likely to care about, we can be sure at least that you care about the product. Unless, of course, you do some kind of industrial biodynamic just in order to get the label. And that's where the label can be a problem sometimes. And that's why I'm more in favor of geographic indications through which the standards are defined by a small group of producers, of local producers, rather than a wide-ranging label that then the industry will work hard on fulfilling the requirements. This happens a lot, especially with the organic label. The industry does some industrial organic products, so they make sure that they meet the minimum requirements to get the label, but they have lost the philosophy of organic agriculture. And so that's why I don't think we should hide the quality. We should hide behind some labels. And actually, for example, in Jingmai, I think it doesn't make sense for the small tea farmers to get some organic labels. It will make sense for the big factories, actually, because they cater to a wider market of people who don't care that much about the tea. And so that will be an indicator for people who are sensitive to this kind of agriculture. But yeah, today my point is about what's the artisanal way of making tea. And so I think having a handmade tea, it requires more involvement from the producer, and maybe it's a sign that the producer cares to some extent about the product. And you can hope that producers who make handmade tea, they produce better tea, not necessarily because the process of making tea handmade versus machine is better, but because it means something. It means that overall they care more, so they will maybe source better tea, better leaves. They will be more conscientious in the work. And so when we're sourcing tea, we're most of the time we want handmade tea. I think there are a few exceptions in our collection. Some areas where the machine making is more widespread. And actually, Mr. Huang, who makes our oolong tea in Ailao Mountain, he has a patent for a very quite an innovative shaching machine, kilgreen machine, that really gives you more control and allows to reproduce a better to fit closer to what handmade tea is, or at least give more control to the producer. And I've never tested the machine, but it's getting quite popular in some mountains. Now in Jingmai, people use machines more for matters of output, because with the machine you can make much more tea than by hand. This is also, of course, what limits our production. We're making between 300 and 500 kilo per season during the spring, and that's really not a lot. Some factories put out 10 tons per season because they have big machines. But it's not the kind of tea we want to make. Yeah, and now I think my tea is ready. Again, I don't want to cook it too dry, but you see, by processing by hand, you can really look at the leaves all along, and you can listen to the leaves in the wok, and You can spread them like this, and that's why I like making tea. So thank you for watching, and see you later.